Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the WSG webinar on Dr. Christine Hopden's forthcoming book, new book, and we're going to discuss that in a fireside chat format shortly. Welcome to the WSG community as a whole and WSG colleagues. Great that you found time to be with us on this rather cold Thursday afternoon. We're going to engage in a discussion and you're welcome to type questions in the chat format, and at the end of the conversation we'll address those questions. Also, there are people on the Facebook format who are watching the webinar as well. So welcome to you all as well. The book that we are talking about, Citizenship in a Globalized World, isn't available on the shelves in South Africa yet. It is available through Amazon and other e-retailers. Hopefully it will be available in South Africa shortly. So with that in place, let me introduce Dr. Christine Hobden. Dr. Christine Hopton has a PhD from Oxford in political theory, political philosophy, prestigious holder of a Max Weber postdoctoral fellowship at the European University Institute, and is currently a holder of a fellowship at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. Christine also edits Theoria, a well-known political theory journal in South Africa. Christine has published widely and has just completed her first book, which will be available shortly in South Africa, Citizenship in a Globalized World, and that's what we will be talking about in our conversation this afternoon. So the format will be as follows. Christine will speak to us for a few minutes about her book, and then she and I will engage in a conversation on themes that come out of this very, very important, I think, and very fertile book in terms of developing concepts to make sense of citizenship in complex environments in countries and in the global context as well. And please send questions through on chat, and we'll address them towards the end of the conversation. Without further ado, let me hand over to Christine to begin her overview. But just before she does that, let me just say the most important part of her CV is that she's just joined the Wits School of Governance and will be specializing in ethics and public governance, and we're very excited to have her on board. She's joined us from University of Fort Hare, and this is a warm welcome to Christine in joining the WSG community. So over to you, Christine.
Hi, Ivor. Thanks very much for that welcome and introduction. Yeah, so the book, Citizenship in a Globalized World, as you'll see from the little blurb that was in the adverts, I think the very core of the book is an invitation, or maybe we can say a bit more strongly, a call to reorient the way we think about state-based citizenship. I think often when we hear the word citizenship in contemporary society, it's linked to questions about status, access to rights, often very much in the news around migration, who's in and who's out. And when we see discourse around citizenship, it also often kind of speaks to the way citizens feel quite distant from their state and feel quite distant from people outside of their state. They don't feel often much responsibility for what's happening outside of their state. So with this kind of context in mind, in a context where we see a lot of xenophobia, a lot of rising kind of very nationalist populism, the key words we keep hearing of Brexit and Trump. I'm really trying to engage with this question. If states are here to stay, is there a better way we can be citizens of a state-based system? And particularly looking more at democracies, but trying to go a bit beyond that as well. And I think there are kind of three main things that I think come out of that exploration for me. Three ways I think we very much need to shift our perspective. So the first one, I think, is really just trying to close this gap between citizens and states. Just to really make the argument that actually there are no states or there's no sovereignty without citizens. Right at the core of the purpose and the function of the states are citizens. And if that's true, we have to take some accountability for what states do to make sure that they are actually living up to their purpose and function. And the second part is to put that purpose and function in a globalized context. So I make the argument that we just can't justify living our politics in this state-based way, being citizens of a state, without recognizing that we do so in a global context, that as important as our particular project is, it's one project among many that have very equal ends, the purpose of kind of securing the basic rights and goods for all people. And finally, kind of in between all of this, there's an important argument that citizenship has to be seen as collective. As important as it is that citizenship gives us certain rights as individuals, when we think about what its foundation is, we do the project of the state as a collective. And that has important consequences to kind of how much we should be noticing how our actions interact with other citizens. And that, I think, shows us, it gives a different lens to the ways in which we might be responsible for things, and also a different lens to what's possible to us, what we can maybe achieve as citizens. If we just keep reminding ourselves that it's not about what we can do individually, but what we can do collectively. So when you put that all together, we end with an account of citizenship that says, if we're going to keep living in a state-based world, we need to think of citizenship as kind of fundamentally a collective project, and one that's embedded in a global context. So as a part of it, it has outward-looking responsibilities and visions, and accountability for our states. So that's the short introduction.
No, thanks, Christine, for the high-level overview and the argumentation throughout the text. I've been fortunate to have a preview look at the text. Is rigorously argued, richly presented, with lots of empirical data to illustrate the conceptual normative points. So an important text in terms of helping us understand these complexities around citizenship. And we'll pursue some of the themes as we go along in our conversation. But just to start her off, a nice warmer-upper in our fireside chat. Getting a book out. Share with us your secrets in terms of your process and your routine in terms of getting a text from a file on a computer to a publisher, getting it out there in the world. Help us budding authors get our texts out there, all of us who are watching this show.
Sure. So, I mean, this particular book has been a long time in the making, and not all pieces of work kind of have those stages of development. Some of the early parts of the ideas were a part of my graduate study, and it's really evolved a lot since then. So I think that has shaped what my process is like, and has also meant I've had a lot of luxury in the process, some time of full-time DPhil study, postdocs and so on, and not everybody has the same luxuries when writing a book. But I would say one of my top tips that has really helped me in terms of routine is I'm a big believer in the writing group or writing accountability. So I've spent a lot of time with kind of friends and peers meeting on Zoom or other platforms and writing together, and doing so also alongside my students. So just, setting aside that Monday afternoon every week to have to apply your mind to just making a little bit of progress is really helpful to me. I think especially because I think while I write, so I'm somebody who writes lots of versions. So just being there writing, even if I end up rewriting it many times, it moves me along a little bit. And I think the other thing I would say about this, and I think this book in particular has really benefited from parts of it being written in very different contexts and times over a number of years. And I think it's really been shaped by those different spaces and encounters with different people and different ideas. So if I were to give advice to budding authors, I think it would be around, it's important to have your idea clear in your mind and your conceptual framework kind of fairly solid for yourself. But just to try and be really open to the ways in which your ideas will grow and be shaped by encountering different people and places, and to really seek that out, because I think it really enriched the project for me, and certainly helped me to feel like I really learned a lot along the way.
Indeed, and having looked through the text, it comes through the reflection, the reworking, the editing, and also the conversations that you clearly had behind the scenes with other people in terms of a text that for political theory and political philosophy reads really lightly. And that's a high compliment in terms of explaining complicated issues in accessible ways, but not oversimplifying the issues. And also the nuances in the text. So I think that what you've set out there in terms of your process is most helpful, and thank you for that. With your permission, if we could start now to go into some of the themes that come out of the text, which are relevant, especially to our school in terms of a school of governance. So the citizenship issues and the public governance issues. Let's try and probe a little bit to get some clarity on some of the themes there. Again, a very rich book. We could spend hours and hours talking about it, but we'll have to be disciplined and restrict ourselves to a couple of key themes. Excuse me. So for me, the important part of the text is the philosophical reasoning about governance. And I say that because so much of the contemporary debate about governance is this technical empirical discussion of governance in terms of testing and comparing countries empirically to establish what works, what doesn't work, what constitutes good, what constitutes bad governance, not in a normative sense, but in an instrumental sense. And there's very little deep reflection on what the benchmarks that underpin the governance debate are. And I found your text just absolutely crucial reading in terms of setting out issues around citizenship, because citizenship is about participation, it's about accountability. So important themes here, and the philosophical reasoning complicates the technical instrumental approach to governance in important ways. Tell us more about how it complicates our thinking of governance in a constructive way, rather than having simplistic notions or one-dimensional notions of accountability, of citizenship, of participation. The reflection opens up so much more to these foundational governance concepts.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think it's really important that we try to bring these kinds of different disciplinary focuses or lenses into dialogue more than perhaps we often do. I think, of course, when it comes to actual governance, sometimes we need to put mechanisms in place. We need to develop policy. We need to have sometimes, or quite often, quite finite things that we put together. So I think kind of having theory doesn't undermine that, as you say, but it draws our attention to kind of really focusing what's going on underneath that. And I think the reason why I think it's so important to keep kind of our eye on the philosophical or the theory is that it can be easy to lose sight of the end goals, of what justice really requires, because governance is really complex, and we need processes in place. And if we keep focusing on the small steps, we can sometimes lose sight of what actually the overarching best case scenario should be. And even when we know in reality, I have no illusions that we're going to, in my lifetime, reach the full living out of my theory. But I think it can nevertheless really shape how we act on the ground, because it reorients our attitude and our way of thinking through some of those kind of more technical aspects. And when I think about this question as well, I often refer to Rick Turner, where he talks about the need for utopian thinking. And it's just such a powerful way, like his message is really powerful because he wrote it in the 1970s in South Africa. So it's this really strong push that there's value, no matter how hard and complex kind of the practical realities are, there's still value in thinking through actually what's the foundational concepts that we need to have a grip on, and what are we aiming for? Because it helps us to have a standard against which we can orient ourselves and measure ourselves, and evaluate the small steps that often look a lot more technical and more kind of finite, good and bad. But when things get messy, we need some tools to think through which direction to go. And I think kind of theory gives us those tools.
Indeed, and the reference to Rick Turner was very exciting to see. His discussion of utopia is so underestimated and underused in the governance context in particular, because the governance debate is quite hamstrung by the present, the now. And you need that reflection to think about what could be, instead of just limiting the discussion to how to do a conventional governance system better. There might be other ways of achieving the outcomes more effectively. And I like that section of the text where you did engage in the utopian aspect of normative thought. And we'll come back to that a little bit later if there's time, because it is so important. But some other themes that come through that I think are important in the text for us as South Africans, as members of Africa, the citizens of Africa as well, the global South, is the idea of a cosmopolitan approach to citizenship, how you try and integrate nation-state citizenship with a more global process. In other words, as citizens, we're not just responsible for ourselves, but for others. And the conventional approach is it's about nation states complying with international treaties. That's the global connection. And you want to push that much further. And I think that's really exciting. And it got me thinking in a whole range of ways. So if you could expand on how you push the nation-state model of citizenship into the global arena without denying the importance of the state, that complex argument, if you could take our audience through that, because it's incredibly rich, I thought.
Sure. Yeah, so I think thanks for the opportunity to talk about that a bit more. I think it's really at the heart of, it's a kind of foundational step in the shift. So as I said, I think we live in a world where states are a norm, and we can't really imagine them not being so. But we also know kind of states' origin stories, as it were, are very unjust. So very few states, if any, can we look and see a kind of a clean history of how they came about. So it's a difficult question to think, is the state justifiable as we know it now? Certainly, I'm not trying to make an argument around kind of as they function now, but I start from this perspective of can we find a plausible justification for the state? So we can say to people, okay, you're committed to the state. This is the best way to understand that as a just commitment. And if we have that argument, we can use steps of that argument to say, well, if you're committed to the state, then this is the way you have to live it justly, because this is the only way we can like put all the pieces together. So that's where this cosmopolitan premise comes in. So cosmopolitan is looking at kind of universal, what all persons are owed. And I start from I think, fairly uncontroversial ground that all people are of equal moral worth. And if you look across quite a few disciplines and philosophies, I think you can find a way to see that in some form, most people are committed to that principle. And then I try to extrapolate from there. So if we are of all equal moral worth, and we have duties to each other to respect that, that means we need a way of living that gives people the basic goods and rights they need to have that life, and to live that life as an equal. And so we can think of the state, and particularly the democratic states, as plausibly our best option at achieving that. So being a smaller system than global, being able to manage and more efficiently provide us with the basic goods that we need, like medical care and access to food and shelter and so on. And also to provide us with a kind of political system where we can see each other as equals. So a democratic system where, run properly, we're able to, as equals, participate in creating the rules that govern us. So that gives us a justification for the state. It's a project or something that we do together as a group of citizens in order to fulfill this kind of basic right we have, but also the duty we have to others, just to allow us to live as moral equals in the world. But importantly, it's one smaller group among many. So it's a kind of, in a way, a very simple argument that to achieve this massive task, it's best if we split up. But we're all aiming for the same ultimate goal. So in the book, I talk about a survival camp analogy where if we split up into different groups, that's the best way for us to all survive in the forest, but not if we're undermining each other's ventures within the group and so on. So that gets us to this idea that we can see that there's perhaps good reason to have a state, but it's not justified in itself. It's justified in the way it serves a larger project. And that has to give us a much more cooperative picture of the global stage rather than a competitive one. Of course, we're going to have a lot of questions about to what extent you can prioritize your own small project versus others. And I do kind of grapple with that tension throughout the book. I think there are ways to think about it, but I won't go into too much detail. I guess to say one thing, that we can prioritize our own state in terms of the basic project of ensuring the basic goods and needs of our citizens. But then there's just this constant reminder that as soon as we're going beyond that, we need to be making sure it's not preventing others from getting their basic goods and needs. And I also think sometimes it means we have to help out others who aren't able to get their basic kind of equal moral worth. Do you want to follow up on that? It was quite a lot.
if only there was more time. But one small theme to pick up on, and this struck me, and it was like a punch in the face in a sense. I'd never ever thought of a state as a potential vehicle to drive a global agenda of equal moral worth across citizens in other countries. And that came through really strongly at one point in your text. And that is just a kind of a light bulb moment in how one might rethink the whole idea of the nation state. And that is an area of much more fruitful discussion and research. So, gee whiz, that was quite a nice insight from the text, and we'll come back to that shortly, if not in the next theme that comes through. And it's maybe about the challenge to the normative idea of the state as a driver of equal moral worth nationally and globally. And that's the focus that you put on democracy. Throughout the text, there's a strong emphasis on democracy as the better or the best way of achieving that. And yet there's a tension, because democracy is a formal process. It's procedural. There's no content to it. The content is given by whoever gets the largest number of votes. And that means Trump, it means Brexit, it means xenophobia, which is taking off in quite a big way in South Africa at the moment. So there's the normative ideal, and then there's the practical politics in terms of democracy enabling a range of projects that are counter that global normative ideal. How do you think about that in terms of the arguments that you present?
I just keep thinking about you saying democracy has no content. I think it's an important point to make, right? It's certainly possible that, as we've seen, following legitimate democratic processes, we can end up with policies that are really counter to what I argue a just way to live a democracy is. And that's a reality I can't run away from, but it's also not a reality that the book tries to preclude. So it's not presenting a form of governance that will help us stop that from happening necessarily, or at least not through institutional mechanisms. And this is the sense in which the book really is ideal and hopeful in some ways, that it is trying to speak to those citizens, the majority who are pushing through certain kinds of policies at the moment, and to really push the idea that it isn't just about expressing my own interest into the channels of democracy and then letting the states move from there. But there is some sense in which we're responsible for what the state does after we've inputted our interests. And that in addition to the idea of reminding people of the global context in which they are living, should, not will, but should shape the kinds of policies that are coming out. So I think, there are two different groups that we might see in the kinds of democracies you're talking about. They're the people who are kind of actively voting for something like a Trump or a Brexit or a xenophobic party or in South Africa. But there are also those people who are not, but who feel very distant then from what the state goes on to do. And I think the book is really pushing both of those groups of people to take more accountability for where we end up. And of course, there's all sorts of nuance of who's responsible where and how we can think about collective responsibility. But the book argues that it's the full collective, both the people who vote for that and who don't, who still have a responsibility to hold their state accountable the best they can. So a difficult one to actually change the minds of people who often have the views they do because they're living in difficult circumstances and they're trying to find what's going to best assist them. But the book both tries to push this shift and also tries to give slightly kind of more easy day-to-day ways that one can do that, right? It's not a sense in which all citizens have to become super activists, involved all the time, knowing everything. It's really kind of let's get us slightly up from where we are and to notice that because we're collective, a lot more can happen when we start to collectivize than we might think.
Well, I can see that once we're either vaccinated or allowed back to our offices, you and I are going to continue the conversation about procedural democracy and whether it's contentless or not. I could see straight away you have a different approach, and I look forward to that other conversation at another point in time. So another area for ongoing discussion here. Another theme, let's run through a couple of themes and then we'll take some questions from our audience. In a book on global governance, on global citizenship, very exciting to see a discussion on African political theory, African philosophy, and an attempt to mix or integrate the African philosophical idea of personhood into a conception of citizenship to enable the grounding of your ideas in a multicultural context. And again, extremely fruitful, extremely exciting approach. But is personhood the same as citizenship in the sense that personhood is defined in terms of structural features of certain societies, whereas citizenship has a much stronger egalitarian equality dimension to it, in the sense that personhood is you accept your role given to you by the community of which you remember. How do you explore and find a hybrid way of thinking about citizenship using these different traditions and integrating these different traditions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure it's one that I managed to answer in the book, I would say. So I think, yeah, it was important to me to kind of acknowledge that the book does kind of come from a particular liberal Western philosophical tradition. So somebody looking at it and seeing concepts like equal moral worth, kind of social contract elements, is going to very much situate it in a Western literature, which I think is in many ways fair. The project originated from kind of studying overseas and thinking these Western countries need to take more responsibility for what's going on. But that being said, I think it's important that like those baseline concepts, something like equal moral worth, it does come in liberal clothing quite often. But in the book, I just try to gesture to the fact that I don't think it always has to come in that liberal clothing. So when I'm thinking about something like African philosophy, for example, in the book, I don't really speak a lot about kind of the fullness of what personhood is in African philosophy. But I certainly think we can look at something like a more communitarian Ubuntu type framework that puts a lot of emphasis on humanity and shared humanity, and is very relational. You can start to see that there might be scope to start from a shared space and to get towards something that's collective and concerned about treating each other as with moral worth. So in the book, that's kind of the extent to which I think I I make the claim about various different kinds of philosophies, that I hope there's space for practitioners of that kind of philosophy to think about how they might share the starting points, and then to see to what extent they can walk alongside me. But I think you're right. When we're thinking about personhood and citizenship, they are going to come apart in certain ways, and there's quite a lot more one would need to unpack around that. Personhood traditionally in a lot of the literature would lead to a kind of consensus type democracy, which includes some of the relational and more collective aspect, but is also quite different to you slipping in procedural democracy into the account versus consensus democracy. It is going to look quite different. But I do think moderate Afro-communitarians would agree to kind of baseline equal moral worth before we start attributing personhood based on roles within society and moral norms and so on. So I'm hoping that we can start from that perspective together with African philosophy.
No, indeed, and fruitful avenues in pursuing that. Very exciting opening there to bring African philosophy into the governance debate proper, but into the global debate as well. Again, also very exciting to read those sections in the book. Again, a short question here, not so much a question, an idea, a theme. If we look at the narrow technical governance literature, they define democracies narrowly, and they test the criteria empirically. And you see over time the number of countries classified as democratic in terms of those techniques reducing. And your focus is on democracy, liberal democracy in terms of citizenship. What about the members of countries? I'm careful and scared to use the word citizenship here. What about members of other countries who don't have democratic governance systems, who live under authoritarian rule, who live in systems that are classified in the technical governance literature as flawed or failed democracies? How do they fit into your argument, if at all?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. I think especially we haven't spoken about it so much, but the book includes arguments around citizens' collective responsibility. So one has to be really very careful in the world we live in today, making those claims, not only because many countries don't have robust democratic institutions, as you suggest, but even in ones that do, we sometimes see the state just acting very kind of rogue, as you might call it, kind of really far away from citizens' expressed interest or implied interest, or that connection gets severed, I think, even in the most robust democracies. So I do try to tackle that nuance, to think through kind of what happens in these cases, even in robust democracies. And then I try to think about, I call them semi and new democracies. So I use less of those tools of who's scoring where on the democratic scale, but try gesture towards the messiness, I guess, of many democracies as they grow over time and have different experiences. And that has some consequences for how we think about responsibility and obligations of citizens or members, as you suggest. I think the one kind of core idea that's left for me is, even in cases where it's clear the state there isn't a democratic state, we just have a kind of a people trying to, there's a formalized state and country, but it's not performing in a democratic fashion. The theory really puts an emphasis on trying to get that accountability in place. Okay. That's, at the very least, people who are members of a state, and a state that's recognized in the global sphere as a state agent, have some kind of base level obligation, and it might be mitigated by the ways they are oppressed, but they have some kind of base level obligation to work towards making the state accountable towards its purpose and function. And the most important reason for that is to try to provide them and themselves with their basic rights and goods and protections. But there's a second layer of that, which I think is about, if a state is an agent on the global stage, it has power to act, and it is ostensibly acting in the name of those citizens or however we describe them. There's an obligation to try make that true, try bring that accountability back down. So I really do try to acknowledge that we're going to have a whole range in which that connection of accountability is stretched in different kinds of democracies and in different ways. But if we have our kind of eyes towards the goal, it changes, what we should, it kind of puts the emphasis on trying to create that accountability. I should also say that I think there's space in the theory as well to account for the fact that some people who are in the world do not have a state that's protecting them or acting in their name. And I think the Cosmopolitan Foundation is what helps with that, because I end up with duties between states, and a lot of things are mediated through this political channels. But at the ground, if those don't exist, then states still have a duty to protect those people who don't have their basic rights protected. It's just going to look different how that might happen.
Indeed. So the idea of collective action outside of conventional liberal democratic process, collective action in the street, protest, holding the state accountable, trying to democratize the state so that those obligations can be performed at other levels, comes through again. So collective action is quite an important theme in the book, and we could spend a lot of time talking about collective action. It's an important one in terms of the text as a whole. But let me jump ahead to a couple more themes, and then we'll take questions from our audience. A quick one. Ethics is often presented as an aspect of the governance debate, not justice. And there are differences between the two concepts. And what's very exciting is in your text is how you start to bring justice into the governance debate directly. And that's very exciting. So if you could tell us a little bit about how you bring justice in and why it's a good supplement to ethics in the governance debate context.
Sure. Yeah, this is something, in a way, I think something I'm going to learn about more the longer I spend at the school, because in political theory, justice is very present, a lot more than language of political ethics, I would say. And I think the value of kind of bringing those two together and making sure we're thinking about justice in the governance realm. I think there's something, there are a few things about justice. I think justice is really about what we owe each other. And it's often talked about in people disagree about this, but when we talk about justice, we're often talking about things we can enforce in a way. We can really say, this is something that you ought to be doing. And in certain circumstances, we can, try make you do it. So I think that's one sense in which justice offers us kind of quite a strong way to paint a picture of what's required of us. And then I think it's also importantly gestures more towards kind of systematic issues. So really what we're talking about earlier, I think, kind of shifting a little bit from kind of what do we need to do right now and how should we regulate our behavior as we do it, to the longer term vision and systematic structural kinds of issues. And I see justice as being able to give us tools to think about that much more clearly than sometimes the language of ethics can provide for us. So that's quite like an initial response to that, but that's kind of how I see the value of justice talk, kind of the strength of it and the more systematic structural nature of it, I think is helpful when we're trying to think about governance.
No, I think it's indispensable, because the technical governance debate is about how to use resources more effectively and efficiently to grow the economy so that people have employment, so that their life chances improve. And bringing justice in is saying, how do you distribute the benefits of governance in a more equitable, fair way? And that's a really important addition to the debate, I think. The focus on ethics, I think, has had limited impact because it's a subjective thing. You can't regulate and you can't legislate for ethics, whereas justice can become part of the policy debate about the overall goal of governance. So governance just isn't this floating thing in the air that is desirable. On technical grounds alone, there's a justice case for defending. So again, much fruitful area for discussions when we finally can have coffee in the courtyard at our school in the future. A final point from my side. We've still got 15 minutes to go, so there'll be ample time for questions from the viewers. Is the whole idea of philosophical reflections on governance, coming back to a theme that I mentioned earlier. It's your text is an unashamed and compelling case for further philosophical reflections on governance and what governance means in countries and in the global environment. As a frustrated philosopher in an applied school, I'm already a convert. Convince some of the people in our audience as to why philosophical reflection, as you do it in your book, is so valuable to a school like ours.
It's a tough question, Ivor. I think I can very much understand that sometimes when people read philosophical reflection or read an argument, it can feel very frustrating because it's hard to make that step between the philosophical goal, and what should I do right now. So I think the first thing I would say is I think there's huge value in it, of course, but there's links between the steps, right? We can't just give my book to somebody governing and say, do this. There's so much more thinking that needs to be done by different kinds of practitioners and academics. So I think, I very much hold the perspective of kind of the need for dialogue and kind of interconnectedness between that different kind of work. And I think sometimes we lose that, and that's what makes philosophical work seem a bit futile sometimes to some people, because we don't have people who have more experience, for example, in policy or practice, reading the work and thinking through what it might mean for the policy. And one of the exciting things for me about being at the school is I think I'll learn more of the skills to do some of that step a little bit myself as well, to have much more engagement with practitioners and people interested in the policy. So that's kind of my one point around. It's where you situate the theory, who you bring it into dialogue with will help it to feel, more practical, more usable than in other circumstances. I think the other point is probably a slight repetition of some of the ideas I've expressed before, but I really think that kind of it's not just about having the the goal to aim for normatively, kind of the should in our mind, that's really helpful, is I think this kind of theorizing really gives conceptual clarity that can be helpful.
Right.
I think in governance, we can get, words almost can lose their meaning because they get so caught up in certain documents or technicalities or processes. So we can think about words like accountability and ethics, and for so many people, they're just going to be linked to certain processes, certain forms that they have to fill in, or boxes they have to tick. And like I mentioned before, we need some of those boxes and forms and so on. But when things get a little bit harder, or we have to make certain decisions, we just really need to understand why those boxes are there, what sorts of different approaches we could take to them, and how do we evaluate those different approaches. So I think conceptual clarity is something that kind of more normative work really offers us as a tool for harder cases, perhaps, and for creative cases in governance. When we need to start building and thinking where to go next, we need to have quite a deep understanding of what we're talking about. And I think sometimes we miss that when we shy away from philosophy.
Indeed, there's always the exception. And what are the criteria that you use to deal with the exception? A major governance challenge in any system. How do you think through a decision based on dealing fairly with an exception? So I'm a convert, so there's no issue there. So I'm sure the audience is glad to hear that these are the only points that I wish to present. I hope Christine is slightly disappointed that I'm not going to ask any more questions. And we'll move on now to the questions that are coming through from our audience. And in the Q&A box, there's a question which I'll just read out instead of paraphrasing. How does your argument speak to the post-colonial environment in Africa, where notions of citizenship and identity are rather ambiguous, and where the state is often a distant alien, if not oppressive presence? So that's from Garth Lapierre. So off you go.
Great, yeah, thanks. That's a good question. It just takes my mind immediately to teaching a little bit on citizenship and thinking through kind of subject citizen dynamics and political identity in Africa. You're right, it doesn't fit very simply into the kind of framework I've presented. I think my approach to this is I want to be clear about what the book offers, right? So it doesn't offer an analysis of something like a complex post-colonial political space. And I think if one were to read it from that space, there would be a lot that you would have to adapt in order to make it relevant to kind of the on-the-ground feeling within the citizenry. So the book asks us to shift how citizens feel about their state, but different states are going to have different starting points of how citizens and people who live in the country feel about the state that's governing them. And that's going to change how we need to go about kind of encouraging people to feel more in control and able to hold their state accountable. I do think that kind of in this, I think the theory can give states who are often not afforded very much equality in the global stage some space to articulate why, to emphasize that their project is of equal value to other projects and should be afforded an equal say in complex international negotiations. And it gives citizens of those states a way to think about what it would look like to have a state that is accountable to them. I think also importantly, and this is maybe a bit more controversial, I'm not sure, but it also presents a way to think about a citizenry as something that's collective and united in a shared project of trying to enable us to all have our basic equal moral worth, but it's not rooted in identity or having a particular shared language or shared culture. So it can give tools to spaces that have a lot of tension around those issues to find a common ground that's rooted in something other than particular identity or language or so on. That's extremely difficult to achieve, of course, but there's a kind of structural way to think about what it means to be a state without relying on kind of links that just don't work in a post-colonial space often.
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks for the question.
No, that was Garth. There are no other questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any other questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, shoot it through quickly, because I'm going to start to move towards closure, and I'm not seeing any questions coming through. So we're almost on our hour, so maybe it's a episode time to close. So let me thank you, Christine, for sharing a copy of your book with me, and hopefully colleagues and the members of the WITS community will get the book and go through it. I strongly encourage it. I think it's a wonderful read. There's humor in it. There's empirics in it. There's wonderful conceptual argument in it. It's a stimulating and exciting read with new ideas, and that just makes for a great contribution to the content that we teach in our school and to our community. So thanks for your time sharing the book with us. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us this afternoon, and welcome to the WITS School of Governance. And I look forward to further conversations with you on these ideas. And I'm sure that our students, the people that you will be in a class with, are extremely excited to expect you to take them through some of these debates in person as you come online in our teaching program. So a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And thanks to everyone who has taken time this afternoon to watch this webinar on Christine's forthcoming book. So I think that's it from the webinar, and let me hand over to Christine for the final word.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ivor, for your taking the time to engage with the book and for all the great questions, and for your very warm welcome to the school. I'm very happy to be here. And I guess finally, just thanks very much to everyone who took the time to be here with us today.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Christine. Take care, stay safe, and all the best to everyone. And we look forward to engaging further in the future.